And now I'd like to introduce our two amazing trainers. We have Leslie Tenbrook, Vice President of Clinical Services with Pinebrook Family Answers, and Carla Benway, Chief Strategy Officer for Youth Advocate Programs. Both Leslie and Carla are also members of our Visit Lehigh Valley executive team. So they're not only helping to drive this train today, but they really help to drive a lot of the strategy and are two of the brain trust members of the brain trust, really driving the work of Visit Lehigh Valley. And so we're very grateful to have them join. Please welcome them, and I'll kick it over to Carla and Leslie.
All righty. So I was really excited to see that so many people knew so much about trauma, because I started doing trainings in trauma in 2010. And I would say, raise your hand if you've had any experience with trauma training. Nothing. I'd say, raise your hand if you ever heard of the ACEs study. Nothing, crickets. So it's really exciting now that when I ask the same questions of groups, people have heard of trauma. And I credit groups like the Resilient LV and everybody else that's sort of promoting trauma awareness in the community. So going to the first slide, we're going to do some talking about trauma. I'm really excited that people already know stuff, but we're going to do it anyway. Because what I would love to see happen is people are kind of jazzed about talking about this more, and everybody goes on Facebook or Instagram and posts something about trauma or ACEs. Every time I watch a video, I go to Facebook and I post it yet again. People are kind of sick of it. But nonetheless, it's important to get that information out there. And I know that there are a lot of people here from my agency as well, and I know there's some new people and some interns, so I think it's really exciting, especially to talk about some of the basics. Not only because it helps us remember, but when we go out there and we talk with our clients, we remember that we have to teach our clients about what trauma is and how it impacts us. So this is all information that we're going to talk about for this first portion that we want you guys to share with people and understand what trauma is and how it impacts their lives. So just to review, trauma is the thing that happens to you. If you have any medical background, you're thinking of trauma as, what happens to the body that's damaging. But when we look at trauma in mental health, we look at it as experiences we have that could potentially, provide some damage or result in some damage or some difficulties that we go through. So it's an event. Trauma is the event, the thing that happens to us, or in many cases, a series of events or a set of circumstances. I'm going to be using examples. Maybe it's something that happened to you like, a car accident, or God forbid, a series of events because you went through some sort of abuse or neglect as a child, or maybe it's a set of circumstances. You were born into poverty or food insecurity or racism. So it's those things that have happened to you in your life that can impact you. And these are experienced as harmful or frightening or threatening. If you come from a home where there was domestic violence and you never knew when you got home from school if mom and dad would be peaceful or mom and dad yelling at each other, but it's almost always a situation that you perceive as dangerous or frightening or potentially harmful to yourself. And it's important to think about the word perceive, because maybe it wasn't actually something that was threatening to you. Maybe someone followed you down the street and you found that threatening, and it turns out that person wasn't trying to harm you, but it felt threatening, and that's where the trauma comes in. So trauma, can have profound impact on every aspect of our development and our well-being, particularly when we talk about childhood trauma. That can impact brain development. It impacts personality development. It impacts our emotional regulation. And as an adult, something traumatic that happens to us, like a car accident, can really impact our well-being. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. The next slide. So another word for childhood trauma, as hopefully you all know, is adverse childhood experiences. And we're going to talk about the adverse childhood experience study as well. But again, trauma can be acute. It can be one thing that happens to you. It can be chronic, like abuse or neglect, and it can be complex. It can be multiple traumas happening. Maybe there's domestic violence in your home, which is a result of substance abuse, which connects to abuse that happens to the children in the home. So it can be very complex. And in addition, our responses to trauma can result in putting ourselves into situations that are additionally traumatic. For instance, if I have a history of abuse and I engage in some unsafe behavior and I end up incarcerated, where maybe there's more exposure to trauma. So that's other things that we talk about. Trauma can be natural, if we all have a tornado go through the neighborhood, or I don't know, maybe a pandemic, that can cause trauma, or it can be trauma caused by other humans. And that can have an impact on how we respond to the trauma. Our worldview, our spirituality, our ability to trust and relate to other human beings. So whether it's natural or human caused makes a difference as well. It can be accidental, like a car accident. It can be intentional, like abuse. And it always impacts our relationships. So that's really something we want to think about. So we're going to talk about the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. You can see on the tree over here, I think there's another graphic in the tree, right? Is there a click to be had in that tree? There we go. So we talk about adverse childhood experiences. Hopefully you're familiar with the ACEs study. If you're not familiar with the ACEs study and you say like, what is that? Can you maybe put that in the chat if you're comfortable doing that? The Adverse Childhood Experience Study is the groundbreaking research on childhood trauma and its impact on adverse life outcomes, health outcomes, social outcomes, interpersonal outcomes. So hopefully that's familiar to you guys. But when we talk about ACEs, we talk about adverse childhood experiences, such as things that can happen in the home, depression, or like family depression, emotional sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, physical emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, homelessness. But we're also going to talk about adverse community environments, being born into poverty, experiencing discrimination, racism, community disruption, stuff that happens in the community, lack of things like opportunity and potential for economic success, poor housing quality or affordability, and community violence. We talk about those in terms of, we call them expanded ACEs. And that's something we also look at measuring too when we're talking about people's exposure to trauma. So the next slide. So one of the things that we learned in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study is how common trauma is, how prevalent it is. And you can see in the slide, 34.8 million children in the US are impacted by adverse childhood experiences. 2 out of 3 adults, us, you guys, have 1 or more ACEs. 1 out of 8 adults have 4 or more ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. When I first heard about the ACEs study, it blew my mind. First of all, how prevalent childhood trauma is, but then how connected it is to health outcomes. So let's look at the next slide and talk about that. So what we find is adverse childhood experiences, the bad stuff that happens to us, can lead to social, emotional, cognitive impairment. I always use the example, if you're a child and you're sitting in school and you have to take your math test and you're wondering if when you get home, mom and dad are going to be throwing dishes at each other, yeah, that's going to really impact your thinking. It's going to impact your school performance. It's going to impact your emotions. And it's also going to impact your social interactions with other people, with authority figures, with other peers at school. And so you start seeing the impact in these different areas in your life. What often happens then are the adoption of what we call high risk or health risk behaviors. Drug use, violence, cigarette smoking, alcohol use, problematic sexual behavior, stuff that can really put your health in jeopardy, but also put you at risk for other social problems. For instance, if you're developing violent relationships with people, sure, you might end up incarcerated or have other problems as a result of that. So what happens is someone who is participating in these high risk or health risk behaviors, that increases your risk for diseases, disabilities, social problems. And then when you start seeing the impact of disease, then we talk about early death. And the ACEs study does tell us that people with 6 or more ACEs do have a shorter lifespan than people without. So that's a little bit scary when I first heard about it, and I thought, wow, that's really, really impactful. But as we all know, just because we have those ACEs does not mean that we're going to be impacted. It doesn't mean that we're going to have all of those negative outcomes. We can heal from trauma and we can experience good life outcomes. So hopefully that's information that you're able to share with your clients in an appropriate way. So there's a lot of things we're going to talk about today as how we experience trauma. And there's a lot of different levels where we can experience trauma. For instance, individual trauma is the stuff that happened to you. Maybe you were in a car accident, God forbid. Your house burns down, you had an experience of abuse or neglect, stuff that really impacted you alone. And that has its own challenges, of course, because then people sometimes grow up thinking, wow, I'm the only person that happened to. And it can be very healing for individuals to grow up and realize, oh, okay, that wasn't just me. That's a lot of different people. That happened to a lot of people. And I know that's very, very impactful when people start to realize that. But trauma can also happen in the family. And that's what the early ACEs study really did look at, is behaviors and experiences that happen in the family. Abuse, neglect, domestic violence, poverty, and food insecurity really impact the family as a group. But in addition, there's other groups. Individual groups, community groups, or cultural groups can be impacted by various kinds of trauma. For instance, in my agency, we've worked with people that were the victims of a bank robbery, which is a very specific group of employees and customers that happen to be in the bank, or other people that were impacted by this, but that's a specific group trauma. We have community traumas, such as a lot of different examples of this, but again, a natural disaster goes through the community. Or maybe there's a closure of a major employer like a factory, and there's significant job loss and a lot of people moving into poverty as a community. And the problem with community trauma is that that usually also impacts not only the community residents, but the resources that are available to them. I'll give you an example of this. I found out from my coworker today, she has an older family member that's in the ER with some significant health problems. And she said to me, I'm going to leave work. I'm going to go wait with this person because she's 50th in line for a hospital bed. And I was just shocked because, of course, COVID, the hospital beds are full and this very ill person can't get a bed because the resources aren't there. So that was a pretty poignant example of what can happen with community trauma. And of course, the pandemic can be seen as community trauma as well. There's cultural trauma. I mean, this is a huge, huge thing that we need to talk about more, but things like racism, how that impacts a particular group, or how we treat the mentally ill in our society. Things like genocide, things that people have experienced that really specific to their cultural group. And the reason that that is so important to talk about is because people who are outside of that cultural group often lack an understanding and awareness of either what has happened or the impact to that culture. If it's not part of you, or you're not experiencing it, and you don't quite get it. And then the last area that we talk about is mass trauma. And of course, this is something awful that happens to us, like, again, I don't know, a pandemic, something that we're all dealing with in different ways. And the fact that we're all dealing with it has implications for how we deal with vicarious trauma, how we deal with that, the role of that trauma in our own life. So next slide. So the other important thing to remember, if we have mass trauma like a pandemic, and we're all experiencing some trauma responses to that pandemic, and we're going to talk about that, but we're all going to experience that differently. If you've worked with anybody that has experience of trauma, you're going to hear things like, well, yeah, I was, physically abused, but it wasn't as bad as, what other people dealt with. So it's really not that big deal. So maybe I'm overreacting. And that's a really, really common response that people have to their own traumas. So it's really important to understand that if you have a trauma, or if you have vicarious trauma, you might be experiencing it a certain way, and somebody else with a similar experience might be having a completely different response. And the things that play a part in that are things like the risk factors and protective factors. Do you have a supportive environment? Do you have good self-care habits? The developmental age that somebody's in. A 5-year-old is going to respond to fears about the pandemic very differently from a 45-year-old. But also the type of adverse event. How severe was it? How recently did it happen? Something that happened to me yesterday, a car accident that I was in yesterday is going to be a lot more impactful than a car accident that I was in 10 years ago, maybe. But when we talk about childhood trauma, what's very, very important is the caregiver's response too. So if you go to your mom and you say, Mom, I'm being physically bullied at school. They're beating me up after school. And her response is to be nurturing and loving and to fight for your rights at school, that's going to impact you differently than if your mother said something like, oh, well, you know, it happens to everybody, get over it. So the caregiver's response to childhood trauma is huge. The prior history of trauma is also huge. In fact, what we say, if you have a single episode of trauma, like say a bank robbery, what's going to make a big difference is how were you doing prior to that bank robbery? Were you struggling with your history of abuse and neglect and everything else that's happened to you? Or was everything pretty cool and now you just have this one thing to deal with? That's going to make a big, big difference. And again, family, cultural, and community factors play a huge role. What kind of resources do you have? Are you encouraged to seek out help and support within your culture? Is your family helping you, or are they kind of standing in your way? So all of those things have a pretty important impact on how we're dealing with whatever trauma we're dealing with currently. So something to think about, and we're going to refer to the pandemic throughout this training, is how do these factors interplay with your experience of the pandemic and whatever else you are going through. So what we're going to talk about next is really how we experience trauma, primary, whether we experienced it personally, or have we absorbed firsthand trauma experiences of others, because that's something that happens as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Carla. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between primary trauma, secondary trauma, and what that looks like. Carla, take it away.
Thanks, Leslie. I really appreciated, just actually being able to sit and listen to you go through that. Because although, this is not new to me, and like many of you, I'm very familiar with it. Sometimes I think it's really powerful and important to allow ourselves to just slow down and sit with it and be thoughtful, as we're kind of thinking about what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis in the individuals that we work with. And also, how are we processing all of that? And I think that has a lot to do with what we're talking about today in terms of secondary trauma. So, when we're talking about secondary trauma, it really is that residue from that exposure. As Leslie said in that last slide, it's something that we absorb. And it's as a result of really bearing witness to often very painful, scary life events that people invite us to share in. And I'll give you an example. When I started out in the fields, I had my bachelor's degree from Penn State, go Blue. And I was making $7 an hour, and still living at home for that reason, because we still have a lot of work to do to advocate for how we compensate people in helping professions. And I was working for community services for children in collaboration with Valley Youth House. I know some of you here are from Valley Youth House, and it was in a family preservation program. And this was like well before we had heard of the ACEs study or of, trauma or any of this. And the families that I were working with were often around my age. It was all young women, all of them mothers, and had all experienced significant trauma. And I will never forget this one day I came home after spending time with Barb. Barb was someone I was working with who had just become a new mom. She was younger than me. And she had really gone deep in discussing some pretty horrific trauma she had experienced at the hands of her father growing up. And I got home, drove back from Barb's house, was in my house, and my dad started, I don't know, probably picking on me about something like picking up my clothes, or I don't know, like it was something. It was like something. And I completely overreacted. And I had a water bottle in my hand and I chucked it in anger and like broke a window. And then I was terrified and mortified, right? Like about what was going to happen. And it was at that moment where I was like, I am not even, upset about what my dad said. Like, I am sitting with like really intense emotions from simply caring for someone and bearing witness to like what she has walked through. And it doesn't leave me unscathed, right? Like, and I think, when we're talking about helping professions, we're talking about people who generally want to help, right? We care. And if you're truly joining with individuals and opening yourself up and listening to them, you cannot help, right, but be affected or impacted by the stories that you hear or the things that you see. So when you think about, each of you is coming to this time today from different professions. I saw some folks from the medical profession, some folks from like social services, human services, maybe some from schools. But when you think about secondary trauma in the context of helping professions, like what might be the types of situations that could expose you to some secondary trauma? And you can either put that in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and share with me. Yeah, Jamie, being empathetic is tough, hands down. But what are some things, like like you heard me share, I heard it from directly listening, right? Like just listening to someone in my profession, in that experience. But what else might cause a secondary trauma?
Carla, I can't help it. I have to jump in. Sorry.
Please do.
I think that if you have, or I had that experience, and then a client comes in and starts talking about that experience, I might have no idea that that was so painful for me until that happens. So when you realize that they have the same experience that you did and you're hearing it in a different way. Right.
It kind of triggers our own trauma histories. Absolutely, Leslie. And for that reason, when I was a director, one of the things I did in matching my staff with their clients was to understand what their trauma histories were, and what their triggers were, because we wanted to be really careful not to match them with clients where that would be really painful for them. So thank you for sharing that. I'll keep going because it might help others. Oh, we got another answer in the chat. Listening to trauma. Yeah, absolutely, Jade. Similar to your own triggering events to work through. Yes. So listening to them. I think about those of us who maybe have to watch interviews of kids, recorded interviews of kids that are recounting maybe some very traumatic violations that have happened to them, particularly from their caregivers and loved ones. That can absolutely be a cause of secondary trauma. Reading case files, anybody who has, worked in children, youth, and services or social services, or even, within the medical field, sometimes you're reading files and case histories of individuals that can be very traumatic, filled with very horrific trauma experiences. And then we talk about our responders, our emergency responders, whether it's law enforcement or people who go out in disaster response and are the first on the ground after that tornado or after that hurricane or fire, and are trying to help repair. I think about, the individuals who responded in Vegas, when there was that mass shooting at the concert, or you think of Sandy Hook, so individuals who are responding to events where there have been multiple fatalities or serious injuries, that's another potential situation that can cause secondary trauma. I want to pause and look at the chat because it looks like some folks, health workers during COVID. Absolutely. We've been reading a lot about that. If you're on social media, personal testimonials of what folks are witnessing as they're working day by day in the hospitals. It's been an absolutely difficult time for many. So, I think what we're seeing here, what we're talking about is the fact that anyone who works in a helping profession, there are hazards in working in that profession that can lead to secondary trauma. And so it's not surprising that we see that 40 to 85% of us at some point in our careers might experience some type of secondary trauma. And that variation is pretty much by profession. Some professions have more trauma exposure than others do, but there are other variables that can impact, much like Leslie was saying, how people can cope with adversity. Same thing if we're in a helping profession and we're being exposed to trauma. Some of us are more vulnerable to having a secondary trauma reaction, right? So as we already identified, if we've already had trauma experiences, that can definitely make us more vulnerable to experiencing or re-experiencing those same traumas as we're trying to help someone else through a similar one. Those of us who are not connected socially, I mean, we are social people, you know, human beings are social creatures, right? So anytime that we're not having that opportunity to connect, where we're withdrawn, being in a pandemic and having to connect to people on Zoom, you know, situations like that can absolutely make us feel isolated and make us more vulnerable to secondary trauma. We all have our different coping styles. You know, I'm sure you guys, whether it's family, loved ones, friends, and even colleagues, you can see how people cope. And those of us who really try to avoid those difficult feelings, who withdraw, maybe blame outward, those individuals tend to have a harder time with secondary trauma. You know, and not surprisingly, I think that we can see that it's not just about individuals. It can be just like it is when we're talking about primary trauma and secondary trauma. It can also be circumstances and conditions. So our work environments, you know, if we're not being equipped with the skills and the training that we need to handle and respond to and understand trauma, if we don't have a way to debrief when something difficult has happened, all of these things can contribute to or increase the risk that we would experience that secondary trauma. And I got to be honest, when I was preparing for this training, I spent like literally the most amount of time trying to understand what we're talking about on this slide, which is the different types of secondary trauma, because it was getting very confusing for me. But what I landed on and what I hope helps in our discussion here is that, first of all, it's not burnout and it's not normal stress. Like, we all have stress in life, you know, and we can be burnt out, but that burnout doesn't necessarily have to be caused by secondary trauma. It could be just, you know, we're not satisfied with our job, we're working too many hours, you know, and that burnout can be rectified fairly easily by just getting another job, right? But when we're talking about secondary trauma, you know, what is consistent regardless of what type of trauma it is that it's caused by trauma exposure, right? It's caused by listening to or viewing or responding to the trauma of other individuals. And it has a significant impact on us. So when we're talking about compassion fatigue, which is also called secondary traumatic stress, the impact of that is usually physical and emotional, right? And you hear about that with a lot of people in the healthcare profession. You know, as we've been mentioning during COVID, it's been very difficult. I think about it when I think of my cousin is a charge nurse at a memory care unit that my grandma is a resident at. And, you know, that seeing what folks go through and being with them through that can be very much taxing on their emotions, as well as on like just how they physically feel, you know, just like that constant exhaustion where it doesn't matter how much I sleep, it just never feels like enough, right? And then we talk about vicarious trauma. And for me, what is different between compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma is in that situation, it is also shifting what I believe. It is shifting my cognitive thoughts, what I think about life, you know, what I think about God. If I believed in God, and now I'm not sure I do, because why would God let something like this happen if there was a God, right? So like the vicarious trauma has an impact that I think can also include, of course, the emotional and physical negative impacts, but it adds that additional element of our cognitive and worldview or spiritual view into it. So to go a little bit deeper into this, I'm going to kick it back over to Leslie, and we're going to look at what might be some of the signs and symptoms. And we encourage you to think about, like, do you see any of this, or have you seen this in yourself? Have you seen it in your teammates or in your colleagues where you work? So Leslie?
Sure. So those of you that have experienced some training in self-care, maybe done a self-care plan, I know those are big in the sanctuary model, have probably seen things organized in terms of different facets, professional, physical, behavioral, cognitive, emotional, interpersonal, spiritual worldview, as on this slide. So we're going to break it down in some of those different areas. And what we're going to talk about a little bit more is some of these areas are a little bit more impacted than others. So we're going to refer to that a little bit later. So we're going to take a look at some of these different dimensions. But what is most interesting to me anyway is that a lot of the symptoms of secondary trauma look just like symptoms of primary trauma. So here's the problem with that. So if I'm okay, not a lot of trauma, and my house burns down, and the next couple of weeks I have some serious problems sleeping at night, I'm going to go, no wonder I'm not sleeping. I went through this terrible thing. But if you have just sort of a collective, you're amassing vicarious trauma because you're exposed over and over to things like maybe it's job related, like Carla talked about first responders, or maybe you're a therapist and you're hearing awful stories. When you all of a sudden you're not sleeping so well, you're not always going to be like, well, secondary trauma, of course. You're going to wonder, why aren't I sleeping? You know, what's going on here? So you don't always recognize the symptoms of secondary trauma because there's no precipitating event, hopefully. So let's talk about the physical symptoms. So if you work in mental health, then you probably know that some of these physical symptoms are red flags for problems that need to be looked at. And my personal prejudice is sleep disturbances. When I hear about people not sleeping well, that's my number one. Let's go to the doctor. Let's do some physical workups. Let's find out what's going on here. Because as I like to preach, when you're not sleeping, nothing else is going to work. So I'm glad we have that one first on the slide for my own, because my own prejudice is like, if I have a client that's not sleeping, absolutely, we're going to the doctor. We're gonna solve this before we worry on some of that other stuff. But as a provider, it might not be something you automatically recognize why you're having sleep problems. So that's an important thing to really, really pay attention to. And changes in appetite are similar. That's one of the first things that gets impacted, not just your appetite, but your whole digestive system. If you're somebody that like holds a lot of stress in your body, digestion is often impacted. And it can be you have no appetite, you can't eat. Unfortunately, I go the opposite way and I'm stress eating. So any of that stuff is an important symptom. So changes in your impairments in your immune system, which is really not something any of us really need to deal with right now, given that there's a pathogen out there. But again, you find yourself having more colds than you usually do, then you're not going to maybe assume that there's a secondary trauma impact. Low energy, low exhaustion, fatigue, aches and pains. How many of us don't deal with that on a daily basis? So that can be attributed to so many things. But if you're experiencing that and it's more than usual, it's a really good idea to really take a look at, is vicarious trauma a possible contributing factor here? And we're going to talk a little bit later about what you do with that information in terms of like, what do you do with that at work, what you do with that personally. But the first thing that you need to do is be able to recognize that. So that's what we're talking about right now. Behavioral symptoms like an increase in substance use. This is another big one. I'm glad we have this first on the slide because it worries me that we make jokes about wine. No, I need to drink my wine. And we talk about wine sometimes, at least I know women do this. We talk about wine as if it's not the same as other kinds of alcohol. And the next thing you know, the bottle's empty, and that's a big problem. But like with anything else we're talking about in this section, it's a change. If you see an increase in your substance abuse use, whatever that substance is, that's really something to look at as kind of a red flag. What's going on here? But lower motivation, withdraw from the activities that you enjoy. I got to tell you, last year in the pandemic, I was in the park every day, walking, jogging, like getting some fresh air, feeling really good every single day. This year, not so much. So the pandemic is really wearing on a lot of us. And that's something to really look at too. But withdraw from activities that you enjoy. And something else that's important to think about is more risk-taking or impulsive behaviors. Now, the first time I read that, I thought, oh, okay, are we talking, shoplifting? Are we talking about starting fights in bars? And then I thought back to a few years ago when my life was really stressful, and my boss pulled me into the office and said, what is going on with you? You have firing off these impulsive emails in response to situations that's not making the situation any better. And I went, oh, okay, yeah, maybe that's an impulsive behavior I really need to take a look at. So it might be something as simple as your responses to people, or maybe you're snapping at your spouse or your children or other people in your life, yelling at your dog. but impulsive behaviors that you wouldn't normally do. So those are some important behavioral symptoms to really stop and think about. Professional symptoms. This is something really, really interesting because this is something that we don't usually think about this in terms of vicarious trauma, but the days you just can't get out of bed and get yourself to work on time, or maybe just, I just can't do it today, just not feeling it. I'm calling in sick again, even though it's, the third day in the month. Stuff that is going to maybe cause a problem for you if it continues. But maybe stuff that people don't see, like a decrease in the quantity of work. You're just not doing a great job. You're not doing as well as you could do because you're not motivated. You're not feeling it. And particularly in helping professions, a lot of our stress is going to come out at work because that's where we're exposed to the trauma. So if you find yourself you're not just doing as well as you could be, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma might be something you really need to look at. And the same thing that goes for increased mistakes, because you're not able to pay attention to things like you typically would, or you're not just giving the kind of attention to detail that you're capable of. And this goes hand in hand with our next slide, which is cognitive symptoms, basically kind of the same problems resulting in the same behaviors. I can't concentrate, I can't focus, I really don't care. Maybe I don't feel like I can do it. I don't feel like I used to have skills. I don't know what happened to them. I don't feel like I have them anymore. Or maybe you're being very rigid and you're just holding yourself to an unrealistic standard of what you can really accomplish, either at work or at home. Maybe your house has to be perfectly clean and your work is all done by 5 o'clock. Maybe that's a symptom that you could look at. A big one is difficulty making decisions or poor judgment. So either you can't make a decision or you're making bad decisions, and that can go back to the loss of focus and diminished concentration. So if you're experiencing those things, whether it's work or at home, that's really something to look at. And something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, hypervigilance, worry. We all talk about anxiety. I don't know a single person in life that doesn't talk about dealing with anxiety. But hypervigilance is sort of a sense that I'm going to worry about this and think about it 24/7 because I have that anxiety and I'm going to try and control this outcome and I have to control it. And sometimes we can't control it. So we're constantly overthinking and worrying about things, the stuff that wakes you up at 4 a.m. because I forgot to turn in that report. Oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job. All of that stuff that's, as we know, not in any way helpful. So talking about emotional symptoms, and a lot of this is having emotions that are stronger than you realize, and shutting down with emotions, like turning them off, or difficulty managing the emotions that you have. So we were talking a little bit earlier in the chat about empathy. I've always said that to do good, healthy, strong clinical work, therapy work, you have to dial that empathy kind of up or down, because sometimes you'll hear a story that just puts you over the edge. Some of mine come to mind. In the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you the stories. But sometimes you kind of have to dial down that empathy because, oh my gosh, I'll cry all day long. Or conversely, sometimes you're dealing with somebody whose behavior is kind of offensive and you need to kind of dial it up to understand where they're coming from. And I think if you're experiencing secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, even burnout, you're less able to do that. So you're less able to manage those emotions that crop up as you're dealing with the stuff that you're hearing. So let's talk about interpersonal symptoms. This is a really important one. And this is also a good area for some red flags because you might get feedback from your family, friends, loved ones that you're a little bit different, or maybe your coworkers. Hopefully you have a good relationship with your coworkers. But some of that's withdrawal. Everybody wants to, go for a walk in the park and you're like, I'm just not feeling it. Sorry, I'm just going to sit home and watch TV. Or I'm feeling mistrust, maybe particularly from my coworkers, or intolerance. I know I get really, really frustrated with people's behavior when I'm under a lot of stress. But feelings of loneliness, like nobody understands what I'm going through, and you come home from work and you have all these feelings and you don't feel like you really can confide or talk to anybody, maybe because they don't know what you experience. A lot of times that's a good time to rely on coworkers, if you can, who do know what you're going through. But poor communication, which can always lead to conflicts with people, but in a decreased quality of your relationships. Things just aren't going well in your relationships, in your parenting, relationships with your spouse, your significant other. All of those things are potential red flags, for secondary trauma. again, not something we always jump to. Why am I arguing with my significant other all the time? Well, maybe I need to really look at what's going on at work. And then the last part that we want to talk about, spiritual or worldview symptoms, is, I love this one, and Carly, you talked about this already, is how secondary trauma can really change your view of the world. Sometimes people describe themselves as spiritual, some people don't, but it can just be like how I see things. Like the world, I always thought the world was a pretty fair place until, you know, I started hearing all these stories. I didn't know all these bad things happened to people. And how is it fair that, you know, I had a nice life and my client experienced all these terrible things? And where's the fairness? And that can be either a religious or spiritual response, or just be a worldview response. Carla mentioned, you know, well, I used to believe in God, but what kind of God would allow this or that to happen? And that can really change you might be angry at God or whoever your higher power is. What kind of person's in charge and lets this stuff happen? So you might start questioning your own beliefs and your own faith, or really your own thoughts about people, maybe about people in the world. You know, I used to think people were generally good, and now I'm not so sure. It can also result in a loss of maybe your sense of purpose, like what you're hoping to accomplish in the world. And we're going to talk about mission and values a little bit further on in the training, but sometimes, like, why do I even bother? Someone was talking, Jessica was talking in the chat about, you watch a parent treating your client, your student, in a certain kind of way, and you know you can't do anything about it. It's not something that's reportable as child abuse, so you can talk to the student about it, but you can't change it for them. And that can lead to a sense of hopelessness. Like, I really can't impact any kind of change. And we really kind of lose, or we develop a sense of helplessness, learned helplessness, if you're familiar with that term. And that makes us feel kind of hopeless. Like, what's the point? What's the point of even doing this work if I can't change anything? So those are all the different domains that we look at in terms of the different symptoms that we can have. And again, just to reiterate, we don't always assume that those are a result of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, but we really do need to be able to look at that. And we're going to talk about responses from employers and organization, and what your organization or your supervisor can do to help you with that. However, in the meantime, we're going to do breakout groups. And I hope people love breakout groups as much as I do, but we're going to make this one a little bit easy. So we're going to ask you to get together with maybe about 4 or so fellow participants. And we're going to ask you to talk, because I know sometimes people don't always want to talk in breakout groups, but today we're going to do it. Introduce yourself, maybe and where you work. We're going to ask you, what is your favorite thing to do in the winter? Just a quick answer. Just share that with the group. And then we're going to ask you, we're going to have about 12 minutes to share a quick story about that you know about. It doesn't have to be your personal story, about a secondary trauma exposure. So say something that you're aware of about secondary or vicarious trauma exposure. Okay? So introduce yourself, your favorite thing to do in the winter, and share a quick story about something you know about secondary trauma exposure. All right, guys, let's do this.
The ABCs of secondary trauma. And I like this model because it gives me only 3 things I really need to think about, because, right, we already have so many things to think about. So I think this helps to keep it simple as we're thinking about how we're helping ourselves stay healthy. So the first thing that we want to talk about is awareness, right? So a lot of what we heard Leslie talk about when she was describing the signs and symptoms of secondary trauma, like, we're not going to notice if we're not practicing awareness, right? Self-awareness. And it is so easy to ignore ourselves, right? I was thinking about this earlier, like in a day, right? We're absorbing so much sensory data, and like, I tell my kids this, but I'm guilty of it too. I'm like, just in my head, right? Like, I feel sometimes like I'm not really like paying attention to what's going on with me emotionally, to what's going on with me physically. Oh, I didn't eat. I guess I should go eat something, So, the most important thing that we can do is really begin with awareness. Recognizing what our mood is at any given moment, recognizing, do we need a drink of water? Did we get up and move? There are some days I can sit at my desk here and be in Zoom after Zoom after Zoom. And that has an impact, So recognizing what we're feeling, recognizing what it is that we need in any given moment. And I think the other important thing is allowing ourselves to experience our emotions. It's not enough to just recognize, at least for me, I don't know about you guys, like I can recognize that I'm feeling sad, but recognizing that sadness doesn't make my sadness go away, you know? So at least for me, I need to give myself space to like experience that sadness. You know, and it doesn't mean that it's all day long, but like maybe I need to just write about it for a little bit. Maybe I'm going to call my sister and I'm just going to talk to my sister about it. Maybe I call a colleague, you know, and talk about a work situation that's really stressing me out, you know, but part of my self-care is not just recognizing what I'm feeling, but allowing myself to experience it. You know, we talked a lot in the previous sections about awareness of our own trauma histories. And if we're being triggered by something that's happening outside of us, inside of us, right? So, you know, being aware of when those situations are cropping up. And then, you know, inventorying our current lifestyle. So we saw on the behavior one, you know, the wine slide, like maybe we're drinking a little more, you know, maybe we're feeling anxiety and we're noticing that like every day after work, we need to have a couple glasses of wine and pretty soon it's that whole bottle. And we know that that's not like good for us, right? So it's not just recognizing it, but it's then making those behavioral changes, right? So you just remember really being aware and exercises like what we just did a few minutes ago when we envisioned our favorite place, you know, mindfulness exercises really help us to tune into the present and into what we're feeling, what we're thinking, you know, what's going on in our bodies. And they don't have to take a lot of time, which is what's really practical about them. Balance. Like balance is a particularly, I think, important thing to keep in mind in the helping professions, because at least in my personal experience, I feel like there is always more that I could do. Maybe I feel like there's more that I should do. You know, I used to feel guilty, right? That I could go home and like the families that I was working with were still in their situations that were really painful and distressing. And so I would have a difficult time coming back and actually enjoying myself. Like I felt guilty about that, right? So I would be available maybe 24/7. And that can lead to burnout. That can lead to, you know, our secondary compassion or secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. So, you know, making sure that we're setting some boundaries in our lives so that we can have a balance between our work lives, our personal lives, what we're doing for others and what we're doing for ourselves. You know, that we're connecting with people that give us energy and bring us joy. You know, that we're engaging in activities that we find pleasurable, that give us hope, that restore us and refresh us, that we're practicing that, you know, time management so that, you know, you're not at your computer at 7 a.m. and you're still here, even if you're on your couch, like on your phone then at 7 p.m., still responding to emails. So, you know, much like Leslie talked about establishing good sleep routines, I think it's important as well to do that in the work context. And then in the last one, that the C is that connection. So, you know, I talked about it before. We need connection, and that connection is to ourselves, to other people, and then to something greater than ourselves. You know, for some of us, it's a higher power. It might be our faith. For others, it's just where we derive meaning in life. You know, what gives our lives value, meaning, and purpose. So some things that we can do to intentionally work on that connection to others, you know, listening to and honoring our feelings, not stuffing them down, not avoiding them, not ignoring them, not throwing them out at other people, but really honoring them. Continuing to learn, you know, continuing to give ourselves new opportunities to grow and explore are ways to help us stay connected to ourselves and what's important to us and what we enjoy. Debriefing those difficult days or difficult situations with our personal support system. Those could be friends from work, that could be family, people in our personal lives, maybe in our faith communities. And listening to feedback from them. I think Leslie talked about that a little bit when she was talking about the interpersonal symptoms. But, really, if your spouse is telling you or your partner is telling you that you've been really irritable, or your boss is telling you you're sending out some pretty impulsive emails, we need to absorb that and take it in the spirit that it's intended, which is in our best interest, and not, react defensively around that. And then engaging in those spiritual practices that align with your beliefs. For me, it's a lot of prayer. I love music, and so blending music with prayer for me is super powerful. But I have a really good friend who likes to get in the kayak and get out on the river and just be in nature. So, whatever connects us to our spiritual practices that align with our beliefs, we need to make time for those. So there is a lot of research out there that talks about how self-care prevents or helps us heal from secondary trauma. And, as we talked about symptoms, there are activities in each one of those facets of our life that we can engage in. And at the end of this presentation, we have a bunch of slides that when Beth sends it out to you all, you can kind of click through those slides if you're like, I need some ideas about physical things to do. And by the way, I picked that one because I'm finding that to be the most challenging for me in this recent year. Sleep is okay, but the eating healthy food, making sure I'm hydrating, pre-chopping vegetables, getting up and moving, especially during winter, because I hate being cold. This is a tough domain for me right now. So if you're looking for ideas, you can check out this PowerPoint when it gets sent out to you for more specific ideas. But don't feel like you got to be rocking all of these domains at the same time, right? That to me would feel a little bit overwhelming. Pick the areas of your life that you think you would most like to emphasize, that you think would have the biggest impact. If you want to know what the research says that if we focus on the domains of professional, our spiritual worldview, and our emotions, those tend to have the biggest gains in terms of healing from or preventing secondary trauma. So a lot of those things we already talked about, right? Engaging in mindfulness, recognizing and responding to our emotions and letting ourselves express them, having a good balance at work, so that we have time to disengage and to refuel and restore ourselves. So these are all examples of things that we can do to really practice that self-care and keep ourselves well. So now we have another breakout. In this one, what we encourage you to do, you're going to be in the same group of people. So hopefully y'all are besties at this point. And you can start sharing with one another, what do you do to protect your wellness? What's one or two things that you find is really important to your own self-care? And then to get us primed to talk about the next part of our discussion, what are some things that your organization does that are helpful to you in protecting your wellness and in preventing or in responding to that secondary trauma? So Ashi, if you wouldn't mind opening those breakout rooms, we'll go back into our groups and then we'll reconvene in 10 minutes to go deeper into what our organizations can do.
So let's move on to the first slide when we talk about organizational approaches to trauma. And the really interesting thing I get a little nervous when we start talking about this. Can we get to the slide? Not sure who's moving slides today.
Is it not showing it? You don't see it?
It's showing the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So when we talk about organizational approaches to dealing with a lot of things, dealing with organizational culture, dealing with vicarious trauma, and supporting employees in this, I get a little nervous because sometimes people are like, well, they are not doing anything and they should do this and nobody at my agency does anything. And I will acknowledge that I have worked in places that was true, but I've also worked in lots of places where it wasn't true, but people thought it was. So a lot of times if you're direct care, or you're kind of like, maybe you perceive yourself, you're at the bottom of the agency ladder and you feel like you don't have a voice, I would like to challenge you in that and say that sometimes you do. It's finding how to communicate effectively with the people at the top. Because I can tell you right now, at my agency, there's a direct care staff that's thinking, there's no way I'd ever call Leslie and give my suggestion. That's crazy. And I have other people that are like, hey, you don't know me, but I'm an intern in one of your programs and I'd like to share. And I'm like, absolutely, we would love for you to do that. And we try really hard to communicate that to people, but that's not always the vibe that people get. So I will challenge you, if at any point you're thinking, well, that'll never happen in my agency, stop and think, and maybe there is a way that you could make your suggestions heard. Because there's some important things about organizational culture. Every agency that we have that does human service and works in this area should have a mission. And it should be very clear, because, you know, put it on your email signature, put it on your wall. But what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to accomplish? So if your agency has a mission, figure out what it is, because a really good agency will keep that in the forefront of their minds when they're making decisions. What is our mission? Okay, we're setting policies around COVID and vaccination. Well, let's look at what is our mission? What is our duty to our clients? So we'll really talk about that when making decisions. And the other part of it is servant leadership. So in a really positive agency culture, people at the top, or people that are above you, really see themselves as, my job is to do what I can so you can do your job more easily. And that's a really ideal situation that you want to have at your agency. So the quote from Richard Branson here is, I think he said customers, but customers don't come first, employees come first. If you take care of your employees, they'll take care of your clients. Okay, so if I polled everybody in my agency and said, what do you need? 99% of people would include the response, I need to be paid more. And I will tell you, I 100% agree with you, whether you work in my agency or somewhere else. Yes, you probably do need to be paid more. Because I think Beth mentioned it earlier, maybe Carla, that we don't pay human service professionals enough. We don't pay teachers enough in many cases. We don't pay daycare providers enough. Yes, absolutely. But when we talk to people in higher levels about that, they're pulling their hair out over budgets and money. So that's the first thing that comes to people's minds. Oh my gosh, I don't know how we'd pay for that. So we need to put those discussions aside. And how do we take care of people in ways that take into account some of those barriers? So let's go to the next slide. So first of all, human resources should play a strong role in employee wellness. And I've worked in places where they do, and I've worked in places where they don't. So most of you will recognize that a human resources, their job is to meet the agency's needs, but a really good place will balance agency needs with employee needs. So sometimes that means sacrificing something for an employee needs. So maybe maybe somebody important to that person has died, and even though it doesn't match with our bereavement policy, we're going to give them an extra couple days because it's extenuating circumstances. But really looking at what can we do to meet this person's needs. Advocating for fair labor practices. I got to tell you, I've worked in places that could care less about fair labor practices, and I've worked in places that it was very, very important to them. I like to say to people, we can't pay people a lot here, but we can darn well pay you fairly. So if I'm going to, if someone comes to me and asks for an increase, I'm going to say, okay, but we need to make sure that people that have similar jobs to you are also getting paid the same amount. So we're going to be fair about that. Opportunities for employee wellness. I know this was really big in my agency at the beginning of the pandemic. We did a lot of, similar to what we did today, mindfulness moments. And we had a lot of things that we did. We had, virtual happy hour and that kind of stuff. Made a lot of changes in terms of how employees accessed their health benefits and when in your employment you could access your health benefits. We made some changes so the agency supplemented some of the co-pays for mental health services, because our co-pays can be pretty high. So there are a lot of things that your agency can conceivably do that really can impact wellness. And opportunities for employee growth and development, mentoring, and employee recognition, whatever that looks like. And that's a great area to brainstorm. Yeah, we'd love to give everyone raises. We can't do that. What can we give people? What do people want? What do the employees want that recognize how hard they're working and what a good job that they're doing? So all of that sort of falls under the umbrella of human resources, and that's an important role that human resources can play in the agency. So next slide, please. Policies are important. My agency became a trauma certified agency, and one of the things we really had to do was we had to look at all aspects of what we do, but we really had to look at how are we supporting employees knowing that maybe they have trauma in their history, or maybe they experienced a trauma. What if somebody, I always go back to car accident, or their house burns down, or they have a serious illness diagnosis and they don't have enough sick time? What can we do with that? One of the things that we did was we changed, this is great, we had so many sick days. Well, you know how you're feeling like your mental health day, so you call and tell your boss you're sick and you're not, and we all know that, and the boss knows that. Well, we stopped doing that. We said they're wellness days. So, call your employer, call your boss and tell them you're taking a wellness day. It's not their business what you're sick of anyway. So, you don't need to be sick to take a sick day. And we also changed our policies around, can you be sick to take care of your sick child? Is that sick time? Absolutely it is. Parents know that. But we also talked about performance management. If somebody is struggling at work, how do we support them without being overly punitive? So that's something that's really, really important and really affects employee wellness. How we handle evaluations, how we set goals, how we deal with conflict resolution, all of that stuff is something that we can really, those are easy to do without spending a lot of money. And also talking about work-life balance. I think that something that's really going to impact discussions around work-life balance is the pandemic, because how many people ever experienced working from home until we had to? All of a sudden, well, what do you know? That's possible. We didn't think it was possible. We thought it was a big deal. Oh my gosh, work from home was so, it's not how we always did it. Well, now we have to do it. So I think we always joke that cat is out of the bag. So I don't think we're ever going to go back as a culture to working from home. We all have to be in the office all the time. So that's something we can really utilize this opportunity to rethink. Do we really need everyone in the office 24/7? What can we do differently? And the next slide. So it's really, really important, and I mentioned this when we started talking, is how do we provide opportunities for people to communicate what they want? I'll give an example. I had an employee, again, kind of several levels of supervision below me, and call me and say, hey, I really think that our agency should have June 19th off, Juneteenth. We think that would be good for diversity. We think that would be really something that we want here. And first of all, I had to give this person props for just randomly calling me to tell me this, and I thought it was awesome, and I told her that, but not everybody really, has the nerve to do that. But we thought it was great. And, we talked about it. We actually could not provide additional days off, and this employee wasn't aware that we lose a lot of money when we close the agency, but we actually shifted some things around so we were able to change our days off holidays. And it was really reflective of what we're trying to do in terms of diversity, but really was reflective of the fact that not everybody shares the same religious beliefs and holidays. So we thought that was pretty cool. So we don't always have people that are willing to pick up the phone and call senior leadership and say, hey, this is what I think we should do. But I would, again, challenge you that your senior leadership people might be receptive to that. Don't assume that they're not. Again, a lot of times we think, oh no, like what's that going to cost? But no, we do want to hear it in most cases. Maybe not every agency, but I think in more often than you realize. So Employee Safety and Wellness Committee, that's an easy thing to do. Most organizations are very concerned about safety, and it's easy to expand that safety in terms of wellness, because an important part of trauma care is feeling safe. And secondary trauma, maybe you don't feel safe, and that needs to be as important as whether or not there's rugs that you're going to trip on in the agency. What we did at Pinebrook Family Answers was we developed a trauma-informed care committee because we wanted to become trauma certified. But part of that was really looking at every single thing we did. Surveying employees, I know employees sometimes get a little bit nervous about this. Are they going to know it was me? Should I really be truly honest? And I can't tell you for sure that the leadership in your agency would react neutrally to negative feedback or critical feedback. But again, I would challenge you that many leadership levels do want to hear that. Different gatherings at different levels of leadership, meetings like having your supervisor attend a meeting that they don't typically do, or maybe getting the whole agency together or the whole department together, and asking maybe your fiscal director to come in and speak about why do we do this particular thing with regard to the money and billing. We can use focus groups, you can use feedback boxes. We're kind of high tech now. There's actually virtual ways to give feedback and survey people that are neutral and cannot be quite as scary. So all of these organizations, this isn't stuff that costs a lot of money to do, have this ability to do this. And a healthy agency will create those or support those. Okay, next slide. And then we also need to really look at our community approaches to trauma and not just our agency, not just ourselves, but what are some of the other areas that we really need to look at. And I'm going to just back up just a second. And just something that we're experiencing at my agency is we had a really, really good culture. Again, people wanted to be paid more and we wanted to pay them more. But we did some serious deep dive research into how people felt about working at my agency. And this was some time ago. And I have to tell you that with everything that's happened with the pandemic, people are feeling burned out kind of with life, not just with work, but it's spilling over to work. We don't have a lot to give right now. Again, pandemic trauma. So we are struggling a little bit as an agency. And we're constantly talking about how do we make sure that people feel heard? Should we survey people? We don't want to overdo the surveys. We have a trauma-informed care committee. What do we do with that information? So we really want to make sure that we have those things in place. And right now, I think we're all struggling a little bit with that. But in terms of some of the approaches that we need to do, we need to develop awareness of trauma, how it impacts people's lives. Shout out to Resilient LV, because that's our goal, one of our goals. And we really need to understand the role of secondary trauma for professionals, especially right now, healthcare providers. Give a shout out to them. We need to be able to have resources available to people that are easy to get to. If you want trauma training, how do you get it? Does it cost us money? It might not. So you can actually look up on our Resilient LV website and find out where you can get trauma training for your agency. And in a bigger sense, working to develop public policy, which encourages everybody to work together and not compete. And we're doing a lot of that in Pennsylvania as well. In society, we need to talk about this stuff. Oh my gosh, if I say that once, I say it a million times, and I put it on Facebook all the time. Let's talk about mental health. Let's talk about trauma. It's prevalent. We've all experienced it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's ourselves or vicariously through somebody else. We would love to be able to give mental health professionals the same respect we do doctors and other medical providers, including financially. And the way to do that is to advocate and elect people who believe in that. And it's easy to find out who they are. We know who they are and where they are. So yeah, talk to your politicians and legislators about some of this stuff. So I know I sort of blew through that really quickly. I had a lot of information that I wanted to get to, but we also want to make sure that we have time for anybody to ask any questions. We have some other information to share with you, but if you have questions, please, please, please put them in the chat, and we would love to either answer you right here in the chat, or maybe we can touch base, outside of this training. And I'm going to kick it back over to Beth.
Thank you, Leslie and Carla. That was amazing. And kind of, I think both of you alluded to, we've talked about this content, we study this content, we kind of live in this space a lot. And I am feel blessed that I have the privilege to listen to so many of these trainings through Resilience Valley. And every time I learn, or even if it's the same thing I've heard 1,000 times before, I hear it differently. And so today I really walked away with a lot of powerful actions I can take, reminders, certainly reminders, but some practical framing. So my big and easy takeaway for me personally is the ABCs. Anytime you can have like an easy acronym that simplifies the action steps for wellness, that I know that really personally helps me. So I thank you for that. And thank you for just like powerful framing. So we got about 5 minutes left. I know it's the end of the day and it's cold and getting dark out, and we'll be mindful of everybody's time. So Carla and Leslie and I are here in your community. We're part of the Lehigh Valley, so you can reach out to any of us at any time with additional questions or concerns. And both Carla and Leslie do lots of trainings too. So through Lehigh Valley or through other trainers, happy to talk through any training needs. But certainly, if you individually or your organization is interested, you can check out Resilient Lehigh Valley website. There's a little training request tab. You just click on that, enter your information, and then we'll try and connect with the right resources. There are also, we're going to continue these every other month free trainings. Next one's really on practical trauma-informed strategies. The next one after that is trauma-informed de-escalation strategies. And the next one after that really is unpacking and understanding racial trauma, community trauma, and equity and building agency. We haven't quite scheduled it yet, so work in progress, but we have a confirmed trainer that's also going to provide some free restorative practices training sessions for us. We just have to really work out when's the best time to kind of package them in. So that might be a summer offering. Also kind of related to this topic and just kind of seed planting. There was something called compassion resilience, and there's a compassion resilience toolkit. So I encourage you to check that out. Some folks in our community are getting a regional cohort of trainers trained. So train the trainers trained in compassion resilience. Resilient Lehigh Valley is going to have some members in that. We're going to be getting trained in compassion resilience toolkit, which is intended ideally for educators, health and human services. So those helping professionals. And once we're trained, we'll be able to share that training out. And the intention is to share that training out with anyone interested in the community on compassion resilience. And there are kind of 12 strategies with that. And we'll be sharing that out free to community sometime this summer. So just really wanted to kind of let you know the details aren't quite worked out with the dates, but we're getting trained in compassion resilience. We're going to be sharing that training out with community. Because you guys have all registered for this training, you'll be on the list for future trainings, and you'll get some notice on that. But lots of free trainings ready to go. And I think for a conversation in secondary trauma and self-care, I think this compassion resilience is really, really helpful and really needed. And to Leslie's point, it's just been a long 2 years. It's been a really, really long 2 years. So a lot of folks are feeling kind of tapped out of whatever resiliency they had. And that's kind of bubbling out in home and school and work in lots of different places and spaces. So anything we can do with Resilient Lehigh Valley to really help our helpers, that is our intended desire, right? Because we need compassionate, capable, competent people who have their emotional tanks full, who really are dedicated to helping, the hurt, the vulnerable, children, families, and individuals. Because we're never going to have a time in our society where we don't need help, right? And where we don't have folks that are hurting and just need extra services and support. And we need to be delivering that help with compassion and empathy. Which really means, right, we need our emotional tanks full. So I'm just kind of in that brain space of really feeling for our helpers right now, and just know that we are carrying you in our hearts at Resilient Lehigh Valley. We are thinking of you and always looking for what can we do next for our helpers? Like how else can we help our helpers and kind of feed their emotional tanks? So just know that we're thinking of you and we're mindful of what you're going through. And the struggles and the challenges, they are real. And more free trainings to come, and this compassion resilience, pretty excited about it. That is definitely coming. And so the last piece at 5 o'clock, so on time, just want to let you know, and I apologize for not including it in the intro. For those of you that are eligible for CEU credits, are interested in CEU credits, all of these Resilient Lehigh Valley trainings are eligible to receive 2 CEU credits for this 2-hour training, provided thanks to the partnership with Marywood University School of Social Work. So just if you're interested in CEU credits, they are available for this and the future Resilient Lehigh Valley trainings. Ashi Singh It'll come in as Abhilasha Singh, which is beautiful. Goes by Ashi. She's also the back end of the PowerPoint, the breakout rooms and everything. Ashi will be following up with you via email to provide you the PowerPoint slides and any of the resource links that Carla mentioned, and any other items that we think would be helpful, or things that was mentioned in today's training. Additionally, the recorded training link, once that's edited and available, that recorded link will also be available on the Lehigh website if you want to share that with others as well. But in that email Ashi sends out to you will be an evaluation link for CEU credits. We are required to do the evaluation, and also Leslie and Carla as trainers really want to know what y'all thought. So our trainers are always eager to hear, what folks think of the trainings, and there's resently Lehigh as well. So in this email to you with the PowerPoint will be a link to the evaluation. Please, everybody fill it out, please, please, please. And especially if you want CEU credits, we would need that evaluation completed. And then in response to that email Ashi sends out, if you would like CEU credits, you just need to email Ashi back and say, yes, I would like a training certificate, and Ashi will follow up with that training certificate so you can qualify for the CEU credits. So email to come likely by end of week, certainly by next week, you'll get that email link. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Leslie and Carla, for sharing your time and your wisdom and your grace with us. I think we're all feel like we can breathe a little bit better after kind of walking through and growing and learning in this space together for the past 2 hours. So thank you. And you're all a part of the Resilient Lehigh family, like it or not right now. So welcome to the family. And we look forward to seeing you at future trainings. Take care, everybody, and have a great week.